Sorry I can't be with you. Um, this is for my New Testament class, and I'm going to give you just a very brief summary of some of the material in Hebrews, especially like tracing an outline of it, and then we'll go into one very familiar passage in a little bit more detail. Well, Hebrews is probably addressing diaspora Jewish Christians, and maybe any other Christians there who identified with them fully, who are facing persecution. Some thus want to return to dependence on traditional religious ritual rather than on Christ. The thought world is kind of similar in some ways to that of Philo of Alexandria, an earlier first century Jewish philosopher who was especially into Middle Platonism but blended in some Stoicism as some other Middle Platonists did, but on a less ethereal and philosophic level than Philo of Alexandria. So probably it gives us a good representation of fairly standard Hellenistic Jewish thought, except Christian Jewish thought. It emphasizes Christ's supremacy regularly over old rituals. Hebrews 1 and 2 shows that Christ is greater than the angels who mediated the law. Hence, he brings a better covenant. Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, Christ is greater than Moses and Joshua, and therefore brings a greater rest. Hebrews chapters 5 through 7, Jesus is a greater high priest than the Levitical priesthood. And what he does to argue this, he expounds Psalm 110 in light of Genesis 14, which makes sense. Psalm 110, the Lord at my right, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. That's how it starts. Jesus quotes that. It's often cited in the New Testament. It's cited in Hebrews chapter 1. Well, that psalm goes on to speak of being made a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. Well, what does that mean? Well, to explain that, he goes back to Genesis 14 and sees what it means to be a priest according to the order of Melchizedek. That's the passage that talks about Melchizedek. Melchizedek was a priest king. Jesus, therefore, can be both king and priest. And having ascended, he serves in the heavenly tabernacle, which is Hebrews 8 and 9 and 10, really. Hebrews 8, as a better high priest, Jesus guarantees a better covenant. And then he quotes from Jeremiah 31 to 34 at some length. And he shows this promise of the new covenant or renewed covenant in light of what God was going to do, and how Christ then in Hebrews chapter 9 serves in a better, that is, heavenly tabernacle. People have often compared this with Plato. Philo, again, as a Jewish Middle Platonist, draws on Plato's image of heavenly and earthly, but you've also got that in apocalyptic literature. And actually, it goes back to the ancient Near East. In fact, when in Exodus 25 it says, make these things according to the pattern that I show you. Some scholars have pointed out that this may be comparable to other ancient Near Eastern patterns, like the Temple of Marduk, the Esagila in Babylonia, was modeled after the heavenly Temple of Marduk, and the House of Baal, as it's been excavated from Canaan. These temples were modeled after the heavenly House of Baal. And Egyptian temples often would have a blue ceiling studded with stars and sometimes with a vulture god flying overhead to symbolize this deity's rule over the cosmos, but also that the earthly was a representation of the heavenly. So it's a common understanding in antiquity, and the audience of Hebrews would readily understand it. So in light of all these things, you've got this consistent warning. Here are some example warnings. Hebrews chapter 2, the rebels against the law were destroyed. Don't you turn back. Don't you rebel against the greater covenant. Hebrews chapter 4, the Israelites turned back. That's why the remains of rest were still called to enter into it, because they didn't, using Psalm 95, looking back at the experience in the wilderness. Don't you turn back. It wasn't, the word came to them too, but it wasn't mixed with faith in those who heard it. So you need to stand firm. Hebrews chapter 6 warns of those who turn back. They've already tasted of the powers of the age to come. They've tasted the Spirit and God's good things, and yet they turn back. They were once enlightened, language that's used later on in Hebrews 10 for true believers. Some people say the tasted, well, they weren't really true believers, but It says in chapter 2 that Jesus tasted death for us. It doesn't mean he just sampled it. He experienced that for us. In any case, they turned back. They crucified the Son of God afresh. They treated it like this isn't enough for us, and they turned back to other things. And the writer of Hebrews says, I'm persuaded of you better things, but those who turn back, they'll find no other hope of salvation. Christ is the only way. You turn back to something else, you won't find salvation there. Hebrews chapter 10, there's no other sacrifice for sins except Christ. So continue to exhort one another and fellowship with one another, provide social reinforcement for one another's faith, so much the more as you see the day approaching. And he gives Esau as an example in Hebrews chapter 12, who lost his birthright and couldn't get it back, even though he sought it with tears, which is taken directly, of course, from Genesis. Well, now I'm going to look at one particular passage. Of course, this is all very rapid. Hebrews merits a lot more time. I actually took an entire course on Hebrews where I translated it when I was an undergraduate. But Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1, although I must say, sorry for being ADHD and skipping around, but I must say that the easiest part of Hebrews to translate for my early level of Greek was the Septuagint quotes, the quotations from the Old Testament. But anyway, Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 1 is a very familiar text, but it often gets quoted out of context, amazingly, surprisingly, and disappointingly. Now faith is the substance of what we hope for. It's being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we don't see. Well, that seems clear enough to exhort us to stand firm in faith. But there are some popular teachers whose teachings influence millions of people. They've gone out on the radio and so on. But they may have spent more time going on the radio and trying to influence people than they've actually spent even looking it up in an interlinear, much less reading the context. I mean, they say if it's not now, it's not faith. It has to be emphasized on now. You have to get the answer now. And they base it on the now in Hebrews 11:1. Well, there are a few problems with that. Grammatically, it would be different even if the Greek word there did mean now, because it would be an adverb, not an adjective modifying faith. But it's grammatically impossible for this to mean now in terms of time here, because it's the kind of now that's like now once upon a time. It means now like moving on to the next point. The Greek word here is de, which usually is translated in other passages but or and. So these teachers influence millions of people, and yet they don't know Greek and they never bothered even to look it up. So please prepare your sermons better than that. And if you're not a preacher, please prepare your Bible studies better than that, or at least your devotions better than that. But even without the Greek, simple attention to context would have rescued them. If you go back and you read 10:32 to 39, and I'm reading this from, I think this is the NIV. Remember those earlier days after you'd received the light, that's the enlightened I talked about earlier, when you stood your ground in a great contest in the face of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You sympathized with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So don't throw away your confidence, your faith. It will be richly rewarded when? Not now, but it will be in the future. You need to persevere until that end, so that when you've done the will of God, you may receive what he's promised. For in just a very little while, and here's when the promise will happen, he who's coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith, and if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him. And he's quoting there from Habakkuk. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed. We're of those who believe and are saved. But what's the faith here? The faith that perseveres to the end until he comes. Well, This is the faith that perseveres despite obstacles. And this is also the faith in the rest of Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when he called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. He lived in tents, but he was looking forward to the city with foundations, verse 10 says, whose architect and builder is God. And you keep going through the chapter. All these people were still living in faith when they died. They didn't receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, Hebrews says. And they confessed. Now, here's their confession of faith. Usually the New Testament talks about confessing our faith in Christ for salvation. Here it's talking about another kind of confessing our faith. Here's what they confessed. They confessed that they were aliens and strangers on the earth. They were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them, i.e., the New Jerusalem. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau in regard to their future, it says. Jacob, when he was dying, blessed each of Joseph's sons. Joseph did the same thing when his end was near. Speaking of the Exodus, again looking to the future. Moses chose to be mistreated in the present along with God's people rather than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a short time. Hebrews says, because he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt, because he was looking ahead to his reward. And he lists all sorts of heroes of the faith in the Old Testament that he doesn't have time to elaborate on, mentions their names, who they did receive some reward in the present, but then he mentions others were tortured and refused to be released so that they might gain a better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging, others sawn in two, put to death by the sword, sheepskins and goatskins, wandering in deserts, mountains, caves, and so on. They were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised, Hebrews says. God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be perfected. He's not saying that always we get the answer now. Now, there is a place for, trusting God for something now. I mean, when Jesus was present, that was the time you would want to go to him, ideally. I mean, the woman with the flow of blood, she has scandalous faith. She's not allowed to be touching anybody. Mark chapter 5, not allowed to be touching anybody, but apparently she's got her head covering on, although it wouldn't be required since she was presumably single at this point. But anyway, she pushes her way through the crowd. She gets to Jesus. She touches the hem of his robe. And he's not ashamed to be identified with her in her uncleanness. She's immediately healed. Well, yeah, reach out to Jesus now. Trust Jesus now. But that's not the kind of faith that this passage is talking about. This passage is talking about faith that endures to the end, faith that stands firm in the midst of testing. So Hebrews chapter 11 climaxes and comes to the ultimate hero of the faith in Hebrews chapter 12. He goes on to say in verse 2, after he talks about running with perseverance the race, verse 2, let us fix our eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down on the right hand of God, fulfilling Psalm 110, sitting at the right seat of the Father, but going through the cross first. And it offers an exhortation after that. Consider him who endured such opposition, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. And he goes on to say, in your struggle against sin, you haven't yet resisted the point of the shedding of your blood. Look at all these people who suffered, waiting for the promise. Well, we too are waiting for our resurrection. We're waiting for the inheritance of the New Jerusalem. We're waiting for what God has promised us. And there are gifts that God gives us in this life. But the faith here, that the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not seen, we look ahead to the eternal promise that the Lord has given us. And in light of that, remembering it's worth it, we can endure whatever we have to face in this life.